Hey guys, it's Courtney. I am going to be creating a project using the ARTEZA 36 count half pan watercolors. I'm also using the Spring Peony stamp set by Honeybee Stamps. Also going to be using the ARTEZA watercolor paper. So I have that taped down to a board here and I just use an old clipboard. Going to start off with my background here, and I'm going to be doing a wet on wet technique just to add a little bit of color to my background. So I'm going to take a flat brush and I'm taking some clean water and pretty much covering up the entire panel. Next, I'm going to take some muted orange or muted yellows. So I'm using Naples yellow, and that was a little bit too faint for me, especially with the wet on wet technique. So I'm going to bring in a little bit of the yellow ochre, which has a little bit more of a brownish tone to it, and that will kind of give me the background that I'm looking for. I want it to be quite subtle, so I'm just letting these colors kind of blend together, and once this dries, it will dry back a little bit. You can use your heat gun to speed up the drying process, but I prefer just to let mine air dry. So I did let this air dry for probably about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to the stamping. So I'm going to be using Pumice Stone Distress ink. You can use Distress Oxides for a no-line watercolor look, but I find that the traditional Distress inks work much better. I typically use antique linen, but it's very hard to see on camera. So I decided to use the Pumice Stone, which is a little bit darker, and I may see my outlines a little bit, but I'm okay with that. I'm also masking out each of the images as I go along with some Eclipse masking paper, which is not as tacky as what I traditionally use, but I find that using super tacky masks on watercolor paper can sometimes be a little bit challenging getting them up. You have no problem getting them up, but if you kind of dig in with your nails or with the tips of the scissors or whatever you choose to use to remove your masks, sometimes it can kind of not really tear the paper, but smudge the paper. And you may not notice it until you start watercoloring, and you'll have a big blotchy area and not sure why. It took me a while to figure out why. So I prefer to use the ones that are not so tacky, and the Eclipse masking paper works out well. So once I had all of the flowers stamped and masked, I'm going to add a few leaves that will appear to be kind of behind the flowers. Then I'll go ahead and remove all of the masks, and we will start with the watercoloring. So I'm going to use a few different colors here, and I'm not really worried about shading. I'm kind of just getting the feel of these watercolors. So I'm using some of the magenta, the amaranth, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and the violet. So for these first few petals, I am doing what I typically do. So I lay out some of the color on the darkest areas, and then I'll go in with a damp paintbrush. And when I say damp, I clean off the paintbrush and then dab it off on a paper towel, mainly the base of the bristles, and let that color kind of spread out. Then I'm going to go in and add some of the violet because I want these petals to be purple and pink and kind of mesh together, I guess. And I just wasn't liking it. So I added a little bit more of the pinkish color to the tips of the petals, and I still wasn't liking the way they were blending. It looks very pretty, but it just wasn't the look that I was going for. And I kind of wanted to experiment with different techniques with these particular watercolors, being this is the first time I'm actually using them in a project, I should say. I also have a video where I kind of just did a quick review on the watercolors themselves, kind of played around with them a little bit, and I will link that video below if you're interested in that. So I'm doing the same thing with this second petal as well, just to kind of see if I got different results, which I didn't. So what I decided to do next is to kind of get the entire petal wet. Damp, I should say. You don't want a whole ton of water or else you're just going to have a big puddle. So whenever I wet an area where I'm going to watercolor, I do dab that off on a paper towel, the base of the bristles, so that I just have a damp paintbrush, not a soaking wet one. So I'm going to go in and cover the entire petal that I'm going to be working on. And then I'm just going to drop in a little bit of the color. So I'm going to take some of that magenta and add it to the tip of the petal. And then I'll take the violet and add that to the base of the petal and kind of let those colors merge together and blend together. And then I'll just take a little bit of that amaranth, which I'm really not sure how to pronounce, and just add that to the very, very tip of the petal just to kind of get a little bit of a variation of my pinks. You can always go back in and add more. With any watercolor, you can go in and add more. And the paper from ARTEZA, I have to say that I really, really like it. It holds a lot of water. It holds a lot of pigment. So just keep that in mind, that watercolor is very forgiving in that you can always change it if you're not happy with your results. As your petals or as your paper dries, the results will look completely different. So it's going to look a little crazy in the beginning. Let it dry. You can use your heat gun to speed that process up a little bit to kind of see what your results are going to be. But like I said, I prefer to just air dry mine and then move on to the next petal. You'll see that I am working on petals that are not touching each other, because if your one petal is still wet and you move on to another petal that's touching that, your colors are going to spread to that next petal. Your colors are going to spread as far as where you place water or as far as the paper is wet. So if two petals are touching each other and they're both wet, those colors are just going to kind of spread everywhere into places that you don't necessarily want them to be. So moving on to this next petal, basically doing the same thing. I'm not going to show you all of the watercoloring because it took me a little bit of time, especially having to wait for drying time and things like that. And I'm basically doing the same thing throughout the entire card. But here on this petal, I believe it's on this petal, I went a little bit out of the lines, which is usually no big deal for a no line look, but it was clearly out of the lines. Like there was no fixing it. So normally I would just leave it like that because watercolor isn't necessarily supposed to be perfect. So I'm going to let that dry for a few minutes and move on to some of the leaves, and then we'll go back and fix that area. So for the leaves, I'm going to be using the spring green and the jade green, which I have to say the jade green is probably my favorite color out of all of them. So again, going to wet that entire area, wet the entire leaf, then add a little bit of the spring green to the tip of the leaf, and then the jade green to the base of the leaf, and let these colors kind of merge together and blend together. You can add as much or as little as you want, keeping in mind that they are going to dry back. So whenever I'm adding my color, I usually make it a little bit darker than what I actually want it to be, just knowing that it is going to get lighter as it dries. So again, using the same technique as I did for the petals, making sure that I'm working on leaves that are not touching the petals that are still wet or not touching another leaf that is still wet, because I obviously don't want these colors to merge. The pink and the green are complementary colors, so if they do merge, you're probably going to get mud. So letting those dry, and I did kind of speed up the drying time a little bit just so that I could show you how I fixed this little area that I went out of the lines. Once it was dry, and you will want to make sure that the particular petal that you're fixing is dry, as well as all of the surrounding petals. I just went in with some clean water onto that one little area that I wanted to basically erase. Let that sit there for a couple of seconds, and then I just dab that up with a paper towel. It will not take up all of it, depending on what colors you're using. Reds and pinks are always impossible to completely remove, but it will lighten it significantly enough where you're not really going to see the mistake that you made. So like I said, I went and continued this entire panel the same way, same color combinations for all of the leaves and the petals. Once that was dry, you can see that the colors definitely did dry back a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and add some spatters. So I'm going to add a ton of water to the colors that I used in the for the flowers, and I'm using a number 2 round brush. You'll probably want to use a thinner paintbrush for this. And then I'm dabbing it up because I want it to be a little bit more subtle. So some of the pigment will seep into the paper, and that's fine. I want it to, but I don't want it to be too dark. I'm going to go ahead and trim down my panel. This was a panel cut just a little bit larger than an A2 card size because I knew I had to tape it down. So I'm going to cut off those white edges, and then we're going to go ahead and add the sentiment. And I'm going to bring out my MISTI for this because it is a textured paper. So sometimes or most of the time, you're going to need to stamp especially your sentiment more than once to get into those little grooves in the paper. So I'm going to bring out the Sending You Sentiments stamp set by Honeybee Stamps. This is an older stamp set, but has a ton of sentiments to use and kind of mix and match. I started by lining up the sentiments that was going to use, and being I've never used this stamp set before, they're super, super sticky and they kept sticking to my fingers. So I decided to kind of separate these and stamp these separately. So I'm going to start by stamping the large sending word, again stamping this twice. I'm using black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp, which typically does give you a very crisp image. Once that was stamped out, then I will go ahead and line up the other two sentiments that I was going to use, and I had a much easier time doing this, stamping these separately. And I just basically stacked these on top of each other, and then once again stamping these twice with that same black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. Once that was all done and everything was completely dry, I'm going to go ahead and adhere this to an A2 size top folding note card, and it didn't have much warping. I know I had this taped down, but I know a lot of watercolor paper warps a whole lot regardless if you tape it down, but this paper I didn't have too much problem, and I did add a ton of water, so that is definitely a plus for this paper. But that is the card for today, guys. I will link all of the supplies below, as well as a link to the ARTEZA store. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.